Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 14.23 top lane tier list. So for different content, like, subscribe and let's get into it. It was a small patch. There weren't a huge amount of changes. Mostly nerfs, if anything, trying to bring down some of the high end, especially in mid and low elo. Both Tom and Zach were overperforming there. Some of the other adjustments were mostly like a full champion adjustments. Aurora got pretty heavily adjusted. They want to try and push her power down in Elite, whilst bringing back some of her average play pick rate, as she's become quite unpopular there. And then we also saw changes to Smolder, quite aggressive changes towards its gold scaling, and then some other champions which I've kind of added back to the tier list. So the D tier then is going to begin with Rengar. So Rengar got a buff this patch. People overreacted to it, if anything. It was a buff to his R total AD ratio from 50% to 100%, and then some additional lethality on that ability. I believe it's 3 to 1, so at 6, 11, 16 when you get those points respectively. Overall, it just doesn't do a huge amount. It doesn't really address what Rengar's issues are in both jungle and top lane. It gives him some additional lethal power on his ultimate when you're looking to jump on someone, but a lot of the ultimate damage never really came from the ultimate purely. It came more from the fact that you had like all the like you'd mash all your buttons basically together at the same time. You get like normal Q, empowered Q, you'd throw out your bowler, you'd obviously cast W in amongst that, and you would drop the ult on them. It's a bit more damage to that lethal combo. You're looking at maybe like I mean, Rengar at level 18 has a total like his base AD is 119. It gains 3 per level. It's not enough to really like solidify any sort of movement on this champion. He still underperforms in both his respective roles, especially for the average player. Only really are you going to get value out of this champion if you're very proficient at the pick. Other than that, I'm just still not going to recommend him. He's still unpopular in the top lane and will probably end up getting removed next patch if his play rate once again goes back down. The other champions here are Smolder, who actually took a pretty big hit this patch in terms of his more traditional builds, the ones which people were comfortably going, like your Trinities, your Essence Reavers. The gold scaling changes definitely more encouraged, and like AD changes have definitely more encouraged like sort of, I don't want to say lethality variations because it's still very early days and we don't really know what Sword is going to be most comfortable with. I've seen some like Shojin Rush variants and then some like high AD items which you really do value, so you get more like value out of the changes on this champion. But for top lane, he looks to be kind of gone at this point. I don't think Smolder top is going to persist over the coming patches. Bot lane Smolder looks to be in a pretty good spot though. I definitely recommend playing him there if you do like this champion. In the top lane, you could still probably get away with playing him into some of the tankier matchups, but into some of the more traditional bruisers or skirmishes, you're definitely going to have a harder time at the moment. Yasuo still remains in the D tier. He still tends to be a bit weaker within the top lane compared to the mid lane. He's obviously a very hard to play champion, very hard to pilot. Also tends to primarily just be played into range in the top lane, and albeit there are some ranged options like your Auroras, your Kennings, your Nars, he's still just not performing that well at the moment, so he does remain within the D tier. Rumble obviously got pretty heavily nerfed because of competitive. They gave him back 30 base HP. It still wasn't enough. He still sits as like a low D tier option at the moment. Jace drops down to the D tier. He just hasn't really found his footing in a long time. The new skin came out. It's pretty nice. I know a lot of people are going to hop on Jace and like try out the new skin, and then realize the champion's really hard to pilot and gonna once again deflate his win rate. Even then, he's still really underperformers at the moment. If you're good at piloting this pick, you can make it work into specific matchups, but he can only really come in as a counter pick. If you blind Jason when you're end up against like a Malphite, for example, it can be really hard to navigate that matchup, and oftentimes you'll just end up getting farmed on sides as you fall progressively further and further behind. He's just not a pick I'm really going to recommend at the moment. On the flip side, K'Sante has moved up to the C tier. This is very rare for K'Sante considering he is an incredibly elite skewed tank pick, but he's doing a bit better for average play at the moment. He's still not the recommended go-to tank here. He's still early game skewed, hard to pilot, just not going to get you net you as consistent results. But if you put in the time, learn the champion, realize what his kill thresholds are, and like utilize his abilities effectively, he can be really valuable. Like, he is probably the premier tank within competitive. Well, I mean, obviously competitive's not happening at the moment, but premier tank in elite at the moment. I don't see this changing anytime soon with how his kit's kind of laid out, but but he's moved up a tier. I'd put him in the C tier now. Sejuani, still really unpopular for the average player, so much so I'm going to remove her again. She'll probably get added back at some other point, but it would still be like your Fimbulwinter and Unending Despair duo, which another champion is really heavily abusing this patch. I'll cover that in a second. Udyr lost a lot of power when they nerfed his RR. I believe they also nerfed the base damage of his R and then maybe his Q damage on monsters, but obviously that doesn't affect top lane. On top of this, in the previous patch, he had nerfed his E movement speed, which did hurt him. Overall, Udyr, yeah, just lost a lot of power. He definitely sinks more down towards the C tier at the moment. In both, well, in jungle, he's not as weak. In top lane, he looks to be pretty underpowered, though. You're still going to be, like, more reliant on, like, those RR combos to chunk people out and people disrespecting your champion, but it's nowhere near going to be as effective before. Beforehand, you might have genuinely just outright killed someone. Now you're really going to just have to hope that you can find those angles of repetitive damage and people continue to just disrespect this pick. Varus remains in the C tier. He's still a very unpopular top laner. It's still primarily just like your standard on-hit variations. We don't really have any more of those unique Varus builds at the moment, as they ended up nerfing just progressively like some of those like builds down, whether that was like the tank build, which they nerfed by making his Q bonus AD, or the AP build, which they nerfed by nerfing down his AP ratio on his W. Overall, Varus not in a great spot in the top lane, but he's still playable, sits as like a C tier option. Vayne, doing a bit better after her buffs. They gave her 10 flat damage on her ultimate, which did help her quite a bit. I can't see Vayne. Did I add her to the I have added her. Oh, she's right there. It did help her a bit. Obviously, it allows her to more consistently find kill angles in ultimate. She's still going to be pretty oppressive in the matchups she was in before, with like those tank matchups where you can really heavily kite them out, utilize silver bolts to do a lot of damage, and then scale up and be a really effective mid to late game side laner. She still struggles into a lot of the skirmishers and the bruisers, especially if they can consistently get onto her and you're not spacing effectively. It's going to be a harder to pilot champion, just not something I'm going to recommend, and still remain within the C tier. Vladimir does have a level of solo agents, like he can carry games. Obviously he's been in stronger spots before, and we have fully kind of gone back to where we were at before the Grasp W takeover at one point. You're looking at, once again, your Aerie and your Phase Rush variants. He's fine, I describe him as at the moment. Like, if you're looking for a carry option, which is AP, he's probably not the go-to, and I wouldn't even say he's like a top 3, top 4 option. But if you're comfortable on Vladimir, he can still definitely net you results, and that really is what a lot of the current picks really come down to. I'd say the overall kind of top lane has been squashed down a bit, and there are a lot more picks which just work if you're good at them. And I would still have some like outliers which are just going to be easier to play, and all their numbers are going to be a bit higher than some of the others. But it really comes down to what you are comfortable at the moment, and Vladimir is very much like a comfort champion for a lot of people. Quinn, on the other hand, is just very unpopular. She still has like those Profane Yomu's builds, but they've been nerfed quite aggressively at this point, and that definitely does hurt her. She tends to be more proficient in the mid lane as well. And overall, yeah, just as a pick, she's very unpopular. It's not really something I'm going to recommend at the moment. Gwen, still like one of the premier anti-tank AP options, really has a good time into those matchups where she's allowed to scale and allowed to really effectively split push without great answers to her. Obviously, if enemy team has good answers, whether that's like point-and-click CC, good shutdown tools, good damage, then it can be quite hard for Gwen to really play, and she can definitely struggle in the early game if she's not able to consistently land Qs, whether that's through the enemy having some sort of dodging tool, or they can just space her more effectively. That can definitely be quite punishing for her. She just sits in the C tier. The nerfs which she received to her AP ratio and her passive really did hurt her, and it does mean she needs a bit more time to really come online. Fiora and Yone, I've discussed before, both these champions are very, very aggressively elite skewed, very dependent on good matchups in the top lane for the most part, where you can really effectively utilize their full kits to like really dominate and then split push or find those team fights. Yone's case sometimes, obviously Fiora just wants to be in those 1v2, 1v1 situations where she can really effectively side lane and drag a lot of attention to herself so she can, allow the team to do a lot more, which is obviously going to just be continuously more and more elite skewed as a skill and as a like macro decision. Both these picks do really sit as like C tier options at the moment. Swain is a okay B tier pick. Like he's still see some play in the top lane. Ever since his changes, he has massively increased in play rate. Mid lane and bot lane Swain look to be OP. I would really recommend playing him there if you do enjoy the champion. Top lane, you can still go like the Blackfire Cosmic variants, which is like a variant which is doing quite well in both the other two roles, but he does struggle into some of those more oppressive like skirmishers. He can really struggle into bruisers if he's like able to be dove on quite heavily. I'd only really recommend playing him into tanks and then into good compositions where you're able to make use of short range melees, or that's primarily the primary reason why you are playing Swain. Enemy's comp has a lot of short range champions which he can really heavily abuse, and he can kind of like free scale throughout the lane and then be really oppressive in mid game on those objective fights and team fights. Olaf sits as a B tier option. He's a great counter pick. You're not really going to see him outside of that. Into some matchups, he can be really oppressive, whether that's like your Ornns, your Urgots, for example, where he can really nullify a lot of the effectiveness of their kits. He can be quite effective in team fights with an Enchanter. Outside of those situations, though, you're not really playing him. He definitely comes down as more of a conditional pick in his current state, rather than just a general good pick, which he used to be in the past, pre his nerfs and Stridebreaker nerfs. Pantheon still remains in the beta. He's still very reliant on early advantages, snowballing, getting his items online to really stay up with the tempo of the game. He is very oppressive early, and that can be really frustrating for certain laners and for certain players into this champion, but he does fall off incredibly aggressively. He's one of the champions which falls off the hardest in the game, and that is definitely where he's quite exploitable and will really punish him for like average play. He definitely spikes as more like a mid to high elo champion, and that can be where he's quite effective, but in low mid, I just wouldn't really recommend him at the moment unless his numbers were a bit higher. Aurora sits as a high B tier option. She looks to be a bit better for the average player. She looks to be slight bit worse for elite. I believe that's the general consensus. Some of her Lost Chapter builds in the top lane look to be better, whether that's like your Ludens, your Blackfires, your Malignances, stuff like that seems to be a bit more performant, with like a Cosmic Drive as like your second item option. Obviously, it will take time for people to once again refine the builds with the adjustments she received, and yeah, I hope she finds a better spot, a more healthy spot for like the average player, and she's less oppressive in elite, because she was like the premier AP option in elite in the previous patch. Camille, definitely struggling a bit more with the nerfs she received in 14.21 or 20, I can't remember off the top of my head, where she took a bit of a tag on the W, the E, and the R. It just puts her back in more of a good spot for like average play, where she sits, I'd say, just below the bar. She can still very much function into matchups she's very good into, whether that's like tanks or just champions, which she can effectively bully with her W and her Q effective range. Obviously, Q, when you're like autoing someone, does gain a bit of range, so you can effectively rotate passives and then output a lot of damage. That can be a really effective tool on Camille. And then you just want to look for those isolated pick potential, and that can really make the champion still quite valuable. Other than that, though, she's definitely weaker. She's still relatively hard to play compared to a lot of the other top laners, and she does sit towards more of the mid to low B tier. Akali has definitely been on the rise as of recent. She sits as more like a high B tier option in her current state. Would I recommend directly playing Akali as a top lane option? Probably not, but she's definitely someone who you can add to your arsenal at the moment as like a good AP option, especially if you're very comfortable playing AP assassins in the top lane and you want something a bit more unique. Akali can definitely fit that, especially with like some of the other AP options being slightly tagged over some of the other patches, whether that's like your Mordekaisers, your Auroras, Kennins a bit further ago, like Gwen, another example. Akali has definitely risen up as like a solid option, and I'd say she is also like a high B tier pick. Definitely could be considered A tier if you're very comfortable on the champion. Gangplank still remains in the B tier. I think he's kind of underrated, especially in elite. For the average player though, still definitely going to be one of the hardest champions to play in the top lane, making sure you're utilizing the full effectiveness of his kits, the rotations, the barrel placement. It's all definitely a bit more unique and can be like obviously a very effective skill lever, which does make him a bit stronger in elite. But I think he's in a pretty solid spot at the moment. If you're very comfortable on Gangplank, he can definitely net you results. Riven, same goes, very hard to pilot champion. If you can effectively like play her, she definitely can net in good results as well. I've spoken to some elite Riven players who seem to like really think the champion is in a really in a good spot at the moment. So I definitely do think there is like merit to playing a champion like Riven, especially if you're like wanting to learn it. Do I think it's just a good champion to take straight into solo queue and play? No, absolutely not. Like, you need a lot of games on Riven. There is a reason why this champion is very heavily OTP'd. It requires a lot of depth of knowledge, matchup knowledge to really get full value out of. She's an incredibly elite skewed snowballing champion as well. And yeah, that definitely does hurt her for the average player. But she's in a better spot at the moment, so she does sit within the B tier. Jack's also going to be within my B tier. His champion has definitely seen better days. The R nerf took a bit of a hit on him. He's still very good in Elite. That is, once again, where Jax has kind of found more of a place at the moment. For the average player, though, he sits kind of below the bar. I'd have him more as a B tier option. He can still definitely function into a lot of those auto attack dependent matchups. He can still really effectively split as a champion. But he definitely spikes more mid game now, especially with some of the changes he's received just over time. Garen, definitely under the bar at the moment. He's definitely struggling compared to where he has been in the past. Garen, obviously every time I say Garen, I think should probably get buffed at some point. Someone's in my comment section saying, no, I don't think this champion should get buffed, which is fair. Obviously, Garen is a very contested champion. Loads of people really dislike him for his simplicity and how heavily he can be, how oppressive he can feel in like very winning matchups. So I can understand that. And into things like Jax, obviously Garen does have an edge there, but into some of the other matchups, he can really struggle nowadays, and I do definitely think that he has lost a lot of power, and it does solidify him more as a B tier option in his current state. Gragas, great AP option in Elite. For the average player, he definitely sinks a couple of tiers. He's obviously very dependent on his displacement, how you can utilize it, his build variations, whether you want to be a bit more durable, whether you want to output a bit more damage, and how effectively can you like utilize his neutralizing power in lane, or just outright kill people in lane. Like, Gragas does have good damage. Like, you can really abuse a lot of champions in lane, and it can make it quite hard for certain picks to play. I do think he's going to be on the harder side to pilot, though, and, like, if you want to get a good amount of value out of this champion, you do want to put some time into him, so I'm going to have him as more like a mid-beta option, but you can definitely make him work, especially into specific matchups where you can really nullify their all-in potential with, like, his E, his R, for example. Kled isn't very popular. I mean, this is obvious. Kled has never been popular, I don't think, in like the last 3-4 years. I mean, 2 years specifically since I've made these videos. Other than like the slight jump when tank Kled existed with that like absurd 104 damage tick Sunfires, which was broken. Like, Kled was probably the strongest top laner, or one of the strongest top laners in the game. At the moment, though, he's more lent towards like the skirmisher side of things, with some of like the lethality builds popping up every so often. He's in an okay spot. If you're comfortable on him, then he can be really valuable. If you want him as like a pocket pick, he can be good into the likes of the Aatrox matchup, where you can really value the Q anti-heal, combined with the ability to just consistently dodge the Aatrox Q knockups. He's still not a pick I'm going to recommend, but there's definitely some value to a pick like Kled, especially with like people just not really having the knowledge of how to play against him. Tryndamere is very unhealthy for the game. He's doing okay. Like, he's in a fine spot. I don't think he has as much individual carry agency as he has done in the past. But a lot more of his power comes from like the macro decisions your team can make, where you can really oppressively split on sides, and if your team utilizes the effectiveness of your champion, the sustain, and how hard he is oftentimes to kill, then they can get objectives on the other side of the map, whether that's like your Drakes, your Grubs, if you're playing like cross map, stuff like that. There's very strength to Tryndamere, and I really also do think he spikes more towards mid-elite kind of area. It really, once again, comes down to like comfort of the champion. There have been different build variations popping up, but Ravenous looks to be the kind of way people want to go, with like your Grasp, where you can just sustain on the wave. You're really hard to ever move out of lane, and that just allows you to consistently knock someone's tower down, and then, yeah, be a nuisance on side lanes, which is where he comes into most of his effectiveness. Kennen is a great pick in high elo. For mid to low elo, he once again kind of sinks down a bit, kind of like a Gragas. Just not going to get as much like potency out of a pick like this, especially when people just don't space as well. They're not good, like, you're just not going to consistently output as much damage as someone like higher up will, with like weaving autos, and that can definitely be quite a skill on Kennen. He does have very sluggish auto attacks, which can feel quite painful to use on this champion. His build's still very functional and good. Oftentimes you can go things like Protobelt, your Storm Surges, your Shadow Flames, your Rabadons. There's loads of nice items for him at the moment. Do I think he's the best AP pick in the top lane at the moment? For for average play? No. Do I think he's pretty good in high, though? Yeah, I do think he's probably a top 3 option for you. So if you do want to put the time in, there is definitely strength to having someone like Kennen in your champion pool, because he does consistently pop up in the meta, and that can definitely be very valuable to have. Silas comes in as a counter pick primarily to Malphite, but he's still okay in the top lane at the moment. I'd simply describe him as that. There seems to be a lot of misconception of Silas, thinking he's like really blindable in his current state. There are a lot of answers to Silas, and I really do recommend people learn the likes of Galio, Ryze, Cassiopeia, Talia, Mill, mid lane, Scoot obviously picks, but even in top lane, the likes of Galio can function here. And he will lose to most bruisers. Like, AD bruisers can oftentimes just outright beat Silas in lane, and that can obviously help the champion quite a bit. He's still a solid beta option, though. Gnar is going to wrap up the beta. I like Gnar. I think Gnar has a lot of value, especially in Elite. For average play, though, I think he sits as like a high beta option. He can be quite vulnerable early on to the game. He's not quite as oppressive as some of the other options, but he can be oppressive if you're like spacing correctly, you're utilizing the E attack speed, you're getting like consistent rotations of W with your Q going. There can be like oppressive nature to this champion, and oftentimes if your opponent disrespects you, then there can be value there. But he will be punished by jungle ganks. He's very squishy, especially in mini form. Mega doesn't give him the mobility that mini has, so that can also be punishable in some spaces, and people oftentimes just won't reward you with those fights as consistently in Mega, because obviously he does just outright stat check a lot of champions. But he's still a pretty good pick, and I really do value Gnar as a good beta option. Ambessa. So Ambessa is probably overpowered. Long term, this champion looks to be very strong. People still seem to be building her incorrectly, though, with like an Eclipse rush, as like what a lot of top laners are still doing. I'd recommend looking at Voltaic Cyclosword. It looks really, really good as an option. I know a lot of mid laners have already moved over, which is very good. Like, the champion looks to be really good for mid lane, mostly because top laners aren't going the Voltaic build. That would be like Voltaic into things like Spirit Shojin, for example. You're not as dependent on Eclipse. Obviously, Eclipse can feel quite good when you're getting like the really hefty shields with your W and your W and the Eclipse proc. That can be quite oppressive for some champions to really play against, but she's definitely... yeah, long term she's overpowered. When people like correctly shift over to the builds, I'll move her like up the tier list. For the moment, I'm gonna have her in the A tier. She'll probably be nerfed in 14.24. I don't think she'll go unnerfed. If you want a good counter pick, my counter pick is Shen. I think Shen really like heavily neutralizes this champion and has good kill threat early on. Like, I've solo killed 2 Masters and Bestas quite comfortably early on into the game playing Shen. Most people just don't really understand, like, I mean, whether that comes down to most people don't understand how much damage Shen can do, or how like Ambessa can really be punished with in some of these early fights where she's a bit weaker. That can definitely be quite punishing for her, but she can really comfortably fight against you in the mid game. That can definitely be where Shen's weaker in the matchup, and then once you have Unending Despair, you can oftentimes fight against her. Talking about Unending Despair, there are lots of champions which can really comfortably abuse Unending Despair at the moment. Maokai, I've moved up quite a bit because people have realised this. Maokai with Unending Despair, Winter's Approach, and Spirits is really hard to kill. Obviously, his damage isn't going to be as high as some of the other tank options. Maokai traditionally has a bit lower damage because he just heals so much through his passive and has a lot of displacement tools. But he's in a really good spot at the moment. The buffs to his movement speed and base health really did help top lane quite a bit. And yeah, the builds, people moving over, have really inflated his win rate. It looks really good at the moment, and I really do recommend playing him into like specific matchups where once you have Unending Despair, you're really hard to kill. Obviously, into some of the AP matchups, you're going to have a harder time because you're not going to be able to rush his item as consistently, as you're just not going to get value out of the armor. But he looks to, be in a good spot. He's relatively easy to play. I'd have him in the A tier for the moment, even like a high A tier option. Renekton, good bread and butter top laner. I know 3-1, the NA Challenger Renekton player, has been talking about Jack of Trades Renekton as like popping up a bit more and like being quite a viable option. I haven't done too much research into it, so you'll just have to like look at him and see what he's kind of going. But I've seen some like Trinity Force into like lethality variations on Renekton. How good is it? I don't know, because obviously 3-1 is a very good Renekton player. He's like actually who I look to for like a lot of tips and like tricks for Renekton. But yeah, it looks to be relatively successful, especially for him. But yeah, once again, could come down to player's skill. Worth looking at. If you're not comfortable on it, that's fine. Renekton's still a very solid A tier top laner. If it's good, he could definitely rise up though. So do be aware of that. You could be ahead of the meta trend there, and yeah, try it out. Alawi sits as like a low A tier option. Obviously, the base AD nerf did hit her, combined with the mana nerf, which she received. This overall has just sunk her down to below A tier. She is still very oppressive into tank matchups where they can't consistently do anything against her, and she can consistently land E and then chunk them quite heavily for their health bar. Is she viable in high-low? Not at the moment. The nerfs did hurt her, especially early game. I'm honestly surprised they went the route they did with an early game nerf to Alawi, as that is obviously more traditionally going to be an elite skewed lever. She does sink towards below A tier. I still think you can make this champion work for average play, especially into some of those tank matchups. Aurelia, the quality of life, passive change to enable her to like maintain uptime on towers, combined with doing 50% damage on towers with it, was nice, and it made her feel a lot better. I think she sits as a good A tier option. She's obviously harder to play, but her numbers are decent enough that you can get away with playing her. I'd recommend, I'd say at the moment she's in the spot where I'd recommend her the most for learning of a champion. Is she one? I mean, like Riven, is she one of those champions you can just instantly take into solo queue? No, you have to put a lot of games into Aurelia. But she's definitely more rewarding at the moment, I would say. And for the average player, she's not going to be as hard to play pilot as Riven. You can put a bit less games into her, which is why I'd have her as like a slight tier above in her current state. Wukong's underrated. I think this champion's actually in a pretty good spot for top lane. He just hasn't really caught on as an option at the moment. There are different build variations, whether that's like your lethality hybrids or your just standard bruiser variations. He is once again still going to very aggressively spike on 2 items. That has always been where Wukong is the best. His lane can be really good, especially into like AD matchups where you can be quite oppressive, utilizing your passive, your health regen, and the amount of damage he can output. But if you really aren't comfortable like trying to like really aggressively play lane, then you can still sit back, get your 2 items, play team fights, and you should be really effective in those scenarios. But he's in a good spot at the moment, a very good A tier pick. Poppy's still really great, really good at shutting down most high mobility top laners. She does obviously lose a bit of durability with sort of a nerf she received in 14.21, where they nerfed her passive shield. It does mean she is just not going to rotate as many shields in lane. That combined with the fact that they nerfed her base AD, which did hurt her, but they gave it back to her in attack speed, so stayed relatively neutral. She still sits as like a good A tier pick. Gonna be a bit more conditional. People don't respect your early game damage, so make sure you utilize that. Even if you're running it alongside like a Manifo Scorch, for example, she can be really oppressive. Sundered Sky, some of the tank options can work on her. It really comes down to what you feel comfortable on and what you need within the game. Shen, still an A tier pick. I do believe this champion's still fine in a lot of scenarios. More than fine. He's good in a lot of scenarios. Like, you can really comfortably abuse the fact that Shen has a lot of base damage. His ulti is an incredibly powerful tool, and he's got a pretty good mid game. I don't think he's the best late game scaler. Like, there are champions which will outscale him, and that can definitely be quite a big weakness of this champion. Especially on sides where, he just doesn't have wave clear until you have, like, Titanics or, like, Barmies items. But then, if you go Barmies, you tend to stunt yourself, so that can be quite frustrating. Overall, if you want my recommended Shen build, it's Heartsteel into Unending Despair into AD matchups. Into AP matchups, you should probably pick up a Negatron or a Null Magic early on, so you can like function in those lanes. Oftentimes Shen is just going to be weaker against AP matchups. That is where he struggles the most. So I'd say he's more conditional. Pick him into AD champions with pretty mediocre siege, and you should be good. This champion should still net you good results. He's relatively easy to play as well. Sion is really underrated at the moment. I've actually played a bit of Sion now with like the Unending Despair Rush, kind of akin to like a Maokai where you go Unending Rush and then you wouldn't go Winter's Approach, you don't really need it on Sion, but things like Titanic Hydra, Sterix, not Abyssal Mars, like one of the other magic resist options can work on him, like Fons or Canic Rookins, for example, into those magic damage dealers. Overall, there's just a lot of variance in the builds you can run on Sion. You don't really need Heartsteel, unlike some of the other tanks, as he prints health through his W passive. So I do believe this champion's in a good spot, and you can definitely function really well with him on like an Unending Despair build. KO obviously is going to perform a lot better in mid and low elo. I do think she sinks down quite aggressively in the higher tiers where you're going to be more punished, but as the games go longer, you're less punished in low elo. She's just more rewarding there, and she definitely sits as more like a mid A tier option at the moment. Darius, doing okay at the moment. He is still obviously one of the most popular top laners in the game, and I'd have him next to the likes of an Aatrox, where They're both still really good AD bruisers. They've just been a bit better in the past. Obviously, Stridebreaker nerfs going into this split. Heart Darrow's quite a bit. He's still functional into some of the tankier matchups where you can consistently get all your stacks. You can be a really abusive laner, and that can definitely be very frustrating for a lot of champions to play against. He also scales better than the likes of a Pantheon, so he can definitely be more functional. He's like a more functional Pantheon, I guess you could say, but yeah, Pantheon is going to abuse you a bit more with a bit more range in laning phase. In Aatrox's case, people really need to start moving over to the Spirit Shogun Spirit Shogun Voltaic Cycle Sword build. It's doing really well at the moment. People have gradually been doing it and like realizing just how strong it is, and that should maintain him as like an A tier pick. And honestly, if like everyone moved over, he could honestly maybe make the jump into the S tier. The nerfs he received back along weren't particularly big. It just took some like a slight amount of power away from him, and he sits as like a mid A tier pick at the moment. Galio is a great counter pick. You can't really blind him in the top lane. He will lose to most AD champions, but into AP champions, he can still be very effective. And if you do end up with him into an AD champion, Sunfire or Roa can work. I don't like Sunfires though. It's a really bad item. You should probably go Roa, or you should just go sit on Barmies and then go Riftmaker. There are different variations, but he's in a really good spot at the moment. He's relatively easy to play. He can abuse a lot of top laners. Most people just don't expect him to go top lane, so that can oftentimes open up some things in draft. Heimerdinger, still underrated. This champion's been good in the top lane for a while, especially with the, every time I mention him, it's always the, his AP ratios got buffed, they nerfed down his, like, base start value, so he wouldn't become impressive in support, and he's just been coasting in the top lane ever since then. He's a good A tier pick. If you're comfortable on him, you should play him. If you're not, you're still probably not going to play him. Teemo got a jungle nerf this patch. He still stays as a relatively strong top laner, though. Definitely really oppressive into some of the auto attackers. His shrooms give him a lot of scaling potential, gives him a lot of control over objectives. He's definitely a good top laner. Like, there is no doubt about the fact that Teemo is very good as like a top lane option. His biggest vulnerabilities are obviously the fact that he's squishy. He can struggle into some matchups if he can just never really find lethal, and like blind is less valuable. Like, you don't really want to play Teemo into tanks, even though you do scale quite well, and that can definitely be like the fallback pattern there. He can really struggle to ever kill them unless you're like consistently able to zone them off the wave, and you've got like a Leandries, for example. Set still sits within the A tier. I'd actually have him like as like a mid to low A tier option. Like, I don't like Set that much. I think he's very obvious in the way he wants to play. Like, you want to be oppressive in lane. You want to be able to drag like a tank into the enemy team so you get good value out of your ultimate. And if you just don't really provide him with the setup or the value he wants within the game, he just struggles. Like, he doesn't have a huge amount of like pick potential outside of that. Yeah, you can things like bone plating, for example, could really not like bone plating. I'd say against Set is one of the biggest weaknesses of this champion. If you want to E and then get your double auto onto someone, you're losing so much damage there, and they just won't really provide you with that opportunity until once again they've rotated bone plating again. So his obviousness really gives him like a lot of weakness, but the reason why he maintains a spot within the A tier is most people won't really do that in low elo. Like, you're going to be able to snowball, you're going to be able to get solo kills in lane, and you're going to be able to drag a tank into the enemy team and then get a really big W, because people just won't respond to it as effectively. So it maintains a spot within the A tier. Obviously, Stridebreaker, quite a valuable item on him. It enables him to really catch up to people and just output damages. Set, it does a lot of damage. That is one of the main things about Set. Singed is very gimmicky. He's obviously very unique in his playstyle, but he's still very solid as an option. He has good items. If you get to those 3 item spikes, he will output a huge amount of damage. Most people won't understand how to play against his proxying effectively. He'll oftentimes be allowed to free CS, and that can be really effective and a really valuable tool to have as like one of your champions within your arsenal. Obviously, if you don't put the time into Singed, he will come across as being kind of weird to play. You will get punished if you try to standard lane it in a lot of matchups, and that will really hurt you quite a bit. So if you understand wave management, wave manipulation, you're proxying effectively, he can be really valuable. If you don't, it's just not really worth playing him at the moment. You don't need to learn him. Trundle and Yorick are still both your stat checky split pushers. They will be more effective the lower elo you go. Obviously, yeah, that's mainly what it comes down to. They value their Demolish, they value their Trinity Force spikes, their Hullbreaker spikes, where you can really just abuse most champions on side lanes, and you can siege towers quite effectively. In team fights, both these champions really do suffer quite a bit. Trundle, you primarily want to pick him into like AD matchups and tanks where you can really make value out of your ultimate and your Q AD still. In Yorick's case, he will struggle into the likes of the Aurelia matchup or champions which just have good tools to kill off your minions or kill off Maiden, and that really siphons a lot of power from him. So they do have their weaknesses, but the lower down you go, the more effective they will be. Same goes for Nasus, but Nasus is a bit more matchup dependent. If you can get a lot of value out of Wither, this champion is really, really hard to match on sides for a lot of champions, and yeah, that can be really powerful and a really potent pick within your champion pool. His E, also a great tool. The Armor Shred can be really valuable, especially if you're pairing him alongside like an AD jungler, or ally ADC really values something like Shred, the likes of MF or Jhin or Draven, for example, if you ever end up taking Nasus into the team fight. Whereas in Cassiopeia, still great AP options, really do value some of those short range matchups and champions which just don't have the tools to really dive onto them as effectively, but they still, like, these two champions will effectively deal with dive once they have like items to survive that kind of like fast response, and then turn it around and then output the DPS needed to take someone down. Both these picks very effective, great A tier options at the moment. And then the tanks. So Ornn honestly sinks towards more of like a low A tier option. Like Ornn is, I'd honestly say, one of the weaker tanks at the moment. He just has a lot of champions which really answer him, and he doesn't abuse some of the stronger items as well. But he still can abuse like your Unending Despairs and your Fimbulwinters, which can give him a bit of power. I'd say he sits like mid A tier at the moment. Cho'Gath, great in low elo, does quite heavily fall off the higher up you go, but you can oftentimes like really utilize the fact that this champion does a huge amount of base damage, and most people just won't respect that. His Q scales all the way up to like 320 now, I'm pretty sure, once you have like all the points in that. But you can still go Emax, and that is still a very effective way to play him with like your Grasp variant. So Cho'Gath has two different styles, whether you're Q maxing or you're E maxing. Q with like Arcane Comet, E with Grasp. You're still probably going like a Heartsteel variant, but he can abuse some of like your Unending Despairs, and he can kind of go like a different route where if you do want some like AP options with like your Rowers, your Rift Makers, maybe, if you can like really spike on these kind of items and you need a bit more AP within your draft. Malphite is a great counter pick. Would I recommend blinding him? No, never do that. Especially if Silas is open, you'll be miserable. You'll play against an AP champion, and it'll just be really hard to pilot this pick. But he's easy to play, and you can still have value in most games. So you could argue that, like, in low elo, you could still possibly get away with blinding him. But yeah, higher up, this pick, yeah, does struggle considerably more. More people will respond to this champion with like good counter picks. But yeah, low elo, this pick is great. He will win against most AD matchups, especially if you go like into like close range matchups. Especially if you go like a W with Grasp setup. Into some of those harder lanes, you can go Q with Arcane Comet, and that is a good fallback pattern for the champion. So I'd say he sits as like a really solid A tier pick. Two champions are moving up, and that is Volibear and Warwick. Both these picks have set as like high S tier options. They're great solo queue picks. Volibear, it's still that disgusting Rower Flicker Blades variation, which seems so kind of like out of the ordinary, but it's still very strong and is incredibly deceptive in the amount of power it has. It's a great build for him. It really enables him to spike on like Jack of Trades kind of power. And yeah, it puts him in a really good spot at the moment, especially in the top lane. Warwick received buffs at 14.22. Most people, I mean, they seem to be clunky in terms of what they did to him. Like the W change seems to kind of like, yeah, be in a bit of a weird spot at the moment. But he definitely gained a bit of power there. He moves up to the S tier at the moment. And then my 5 other picks. So Zach got nerfed this patch. He sits as like a lower S tier option. He lost power. I mean, there's no avoiding that. He doesn't do as much damage as before, and that makes him a bit weaker. So he sits as like a low S tier option now. Oh god, I still love this pick. I think he's very deserving of an S tier spot. Same goes for Mordekaiser. Mordekaiser is a bit more low elo skewed, but he's like one of the best AP options you have accessible to you at the moment, and he will beat most tanks. So blind tanks, Mordekaiser is a great answer to that. In Argot's case, it's still like your Phase Rush, Shojin, and Shojin into, my brain's not working, Shojin into Cleaver into Shojin modes. I play this champion, and yeah, he really spikes quite aggressively on that 2-item core. At level 9, when you get access to toggle, at level 13, once you have full value of your, once you have like full cooldown on your shotgun legs, this champion is incredibly oppressive. He does have a slightly weaker laning phase. The lower down you go, the less likely you're going to be punished for it. His level 1 with E is still very good though. That is the strongest part of his early levels. Like, you can oftentimes catch people out if you're running Ignite. You can even look for solo kill angles there. So he's a really good pick at the moment. I really do recommend most people learn him. Mundo and Tarm are also both great low elo tank options. Tarm was in my S plus tier because of just how egregious his AP build was last patch, especially in mid and low elo. It's slightly weaker this patch. It is still very good though. I still recommend going it as like his core build, the Heartsteel into Riftmaker build with like a proto belt as like your 3rd item, or just standard tank where that's like an unending despair, for example. He's still in a great spot. And Mundo, obviously, great Heartsteel abuser, has great tank items accessible to him. Well, when I say great tank items, Unending Despair is just one of the best items in the game, if not outright just the best. It's so good, it synergizes with so many of these champions' kits. It can pair really nicely with like a Abyssal Mask, for example, so you're getting more damage and you're healing more from that. Obviously, Mundo doesn't really value Abyssal Mask, but there are good items for him. He can opt into things like Sterx, Overlord's Bloodmail later on to his build, but yeah, you do want like Unending Despairs, your spirits, obviously, so you have a bit more durability. But overall, those are my thoughts. I do really recommend the S tier picks as a traditionally a bit more easier. They're very stat checky, and they're very oppressive in mid and low elo at the moment, but a lot of the pool works at the moment. Like, the A and the B tier are very large. Like, there is a very large amount of champions here, which can like really reward you if you're very comfortable on them. A tier, obviously, going to still remain some of the easier options, or scaling picks, or just like have some unique kind of builds which really do function quite well of them. And then B tier, oftentimes you're harder to pilot picks. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.